All right, let's go. Number 10, Ololiuqui. In 1651, Francisco Hernandez, the royal physician appointed by Philip II of Spain to survey the medicinal plants of New Spain, published a compendium that included a plant the indigenous Nahua people called Ololiuqui. The plant was Turbina corymbosa, a morning glory vine, common, unremarkable in appearance, and in the active religious practice of central Mexico for at least 2 millennia, it was not a medicinal plant. It was not a ceremonial tool. It was a god with a name, a god with a mythology, a god whose effigy was carved into stone. The people who consumed its seeds were not taking a drug to approach the divine. They were in direct relationship with a divine being whose botanical body happened to grow in their cornfields. Hernandez recorded that the seeds produced visions, that practitioners communicated with the divine through them, and that the priest users were not considered to be under the influence of a plant. They were considered to be in conversation with one. He assumed this was superstition. He was looking at a god with a botanical body and saw a primitive misunderstanding. What he failed to grasp took another 3 centuries to establish biochemically. In 1960, Albert Hofmann, the Swiss chemist who had first synthesized LSD-25 from ergot fungus in 1938, conducted a chemical analysis of Ololiuqui seeds at the request of ethnomycologist R. Gordon Wasson. Hofmann published the results in the German journal Planta Medica in 1961. The seeds of Turbina corymbosa contained ergine and isoergine, lysergic acid amide compounds, structurally related to LSD-25, acting on the same 5-HT2A serotonin receptor sites. A psychedelic of comparable mechanism to the compound Hofmann had synthesized in a Swiss laboratory was growing wild in Mexican fields, accessible to anyone who could pull a vine. The botanical establishment was skeptical. The pharmacological data was not. Ololiuqui worked exactly the way the Aztecs said it worked, by a mechanism that took 20th century neurochemistry to describe. But here's where the account becomes something other than a story about pharmacological discovery. The Aztec did not use Ololiuqui as medicine. They did not use it recreationally. The divine being associated with this plant had a name, Xochipilli, the Prince of Flowers. His stone effigy, unearthed from the slopes of Popocatépetl in the 19th century, and now housed in the Museo Nacional de Antropología in Mexico City, is carved with 9 identifiable psychoactive plants. Ololiuqui appears not as a carved decorative element, but as a divine attribute, part of the god's body itself. The deity does not hold the plant. The deity and the plant are aspects of the same thing. The statue dates to the early 16th century at the latest. The veneration is older by centuries. Post-conquest confessional manuals produced by Spanish missionaries for indigenous clergy asked converts directly whether they had spoken to the Ololiuqui, not used the plant, not consumed it, spoken to it. The language treats the seed as an interlocutor. In Nahua theology, the seed was not a tool for producing an altered state. It was a divine presence that agreed to communicate under conditions of proper ritual approach. Modern neuroscience can describe the mechanism. Johns Hopkins, NYU, and the Beckley Foundation have documented under clinical conditions the specific phenomena that lysergic amides produce: dissolution of ego boundaries, visual reorganization, auditory phenomena, and what researchers now call the noetic quality of the experience. The persistent sense, recognized across cultural contexts, that insight was revealed rather than generated. Whether this constitutes communication in any ontological sense lies beyond what neurochemistry can answer. The Aztec had an answer. They built temples around it. What the Ololiuqui story leaves behind is a specific problem for the colonial account of Mesoamerican religion as primitive animism. A civilization that identified a pharmacologically precise psychedelic compound in a vine, developed ritual protocols for its safe and meaningful use, built an iconographic tradition around its deity status, and recorded all of this in sufficient detail that a 20th century biochemist could confirm the pharmacological mechanism. That civilization was not confused about what it was dealing with. It was a morning glory. It was also a god. The confusion was ours. All right, let's go. Number 9, Datura. On the eastern slopes of the Deccan Plateau, carved into temple walls across Karnataka, Rajasthan, and Gujarat, a flower appears with a frequency that only the lotus rivals in Hindu iconographic vocabulary. Long, narrow white petals arranged in a trumpet shape, a geometry so distinctive that it remains recognizable across 8 centuries of artistic tradition. Datura metel. Datura in Sanskrit. The plant that Hindu scripture does not merely associate with the god Shiva. The plant that Hindu scripture says grew from Shiva's own chest. The Shiva Purana is specific. At the churning of the primordial ocean, the creation event in which gods and demons cooperated to extract cosmic substances from the water, poison emerged first before nectar, and Shiva consumed the poison to protect creation. From his body, from the poison already absorbed, Datura grew. Not given to Shiva, not placed before him in offering, grown from him. The plant is not an offering to the deity. The plant is part of the deity's body, returned to its source when placed at the lingam. This is active practice. As of the present day, fresh Datura leaves, seeds, and flowers are placed in regular worship at Shiva temples across northern and central India. Priests who handle them as part of ritual receive instruction in their toxicity because the danger is real, measurable, and documented in a consistent stream of rural poisoning cases each year. The chemistry makes the theology legible. Datura metal contains scopolamine, atropine, and hyoscyamine at concentrations approximately twice those found in European Mandragora officinarum. The pharmacological action is a full anticholinergic syndrome. Pupil dilation, suppression of secretions, elevated heart rate, hyperthermia, and at doses only modestly above the threshold that produces these effects, complete delirium. Not a psychedelic experience in which the user retains awareness of altered consciousness. A genuine delirium, indistinguishable from psychosis, in which hallucinations are experienced as reality, and the user has no insight into the pharmacological cause. People have died from accidental Datura exposure in quantities that would not have been recognized as a dose. But here's where the picture of people worshipping a plant they did not understand collapses under specific textual evidence. The Sushruta Samhita, one of the 2 foundational texts of Ayurvedic medicine, compiled from oral sources dating conservatively to the 6th century BCE, contains a systematic account of Datura that distinguishes precisely between sub-threshold doses used to manage asthma and respiratory conditions, full hallucinogenic doses used in surgical pain management, and lethal doses. This is not anecdotal knowledge. This is a dose-response curve, in text from 2,500 years ago. The same document recommends Datura in combination with 2 other anticholinergic plants, mandrake and henbane, for surgical anesthesia. A triple compound anticholinergic protocol that modern toxicology would confirm as pharmacologically sound if extremely dangerous to calibrate. The people placing Datura at the Shiva lingam were not doing so in ignorance of what it was. They were doing so in the knowledge, documented and systematized across 2,500 years of text, of exactly what it was. A substance that could render consciousness permeable, that could dissolve the boundary between the human condition and something beyond it, that was physically dangerous in direct proportion to its transformative power. You bring it to the God who holds both creation and destruction, because he is the only figure large enough to contain what it is. Shiva destroys what cannot be sustained. His flower ensures that the experience of approaching him is not comfortable. The offering is honest. That is the theology. Nothing metaphorical, nothing allegorical. A plant that can kill you placed before a God who might. The logic is consistent from beginning to end. All right, let's go. Number 8, Kaikion. 18 miles west of Athens, on a plain above the Saronic Gulf, stood a complex of buildings centered on a single structure that the Greeks called the Telesterion, the Hall of Initiation. It belonged to the Eleusinian Mysteries, the most significant religious institution in the ancient Greek world, which operated without documented interruption from approximately the 15th century BCE until the Roman Emperor Theodosius I ordered all pagan sanctuaries closed in 392 CE 9 centuries, an initiation cycle that resumed every September. Approximately 3,000 people per year. The Mysteries' central ritual involved the consumption of a drink called kaikaion, barley-based, flavored with pennyroyal, served in a specific vessel to initiates in a specific state of preparation, following days of fasting and ritual abstinence. What happened to the people who drank it has been reported by a more distinguished list of witnesses than perhaps any other religious experience in the ancient world. Cicero drank the kaikion. So did Pindar, Marcus Aurelius, Hadrian, Plato, and Sophocles. Their descriptions agree on the substance of what the experience produced. Not a better understanding of death, not a philosophical reframing of mortality, but a direct experiential apprehension of what lay beyond it. Plutarch, writing in the 1st century CE as a mysteries initiate himself, described the experience as producing a complete reshaping of the soul toward the divine. Pindar wrote that those who had seen the mysteries had no reason to fear death. Aristotle specified that initiates at Eleusis did not learn but experienced, not mathein but pathein. The distinction is his in the original Greek, and it is precise. In 1978, 3 researchers jointly published a monograph called The Road to Eleusis, Unveiling the Secret of the Mysteries. R. Gordon Wasson, who had documented psilocybin mushroom ceremonies among the Mazatec of Mexico in 1955. Albert Hoffman, who had synthesized LSD from ergot fungus in 1938. Carl Ruck, classical scholar at Boston University. Their argument was direct. The kaikion was psychoactive. The barley used to prepare it was ergotized. Contaminated with Claviceps purpurea, the ergot fungus whose alkaloids include ergotamine and ergonovine, precursor compounds to the LSD molecules Hoffman had synthesized 40 years earlier. A decoction of ergotized barley and water prepared under controlled conditions would reliably produce profound visionary experiences across all participants. The classical establishment responded with skepticism. Ergot contamination of grain was common in antiquity, which cuts both ways. It would have been difficult to avoid, and it would have been well understood by priests who worked with grain for ceremonial purposes. Direct physical evidence of ergot in the Eleusinian grain supply has not been recovered from excavation. That evidence in organic form does not survive well in the archaeological record. What has not been challenged is what the initiates reported. 9 centuries of testimony from some of the best documented observers in the ancient world agrees that what happened in the Telesterion did not feel like theater or philosophy. Something happened. Something that justified the most severe legal protection in Athenian law. Revealing the mysteries was a capital offense. The general Alcibiades was tried, convicted in absentia, and sentenced to death in 415 BCE for staging a private reenactment at a dinner party. His property was confiscated. His name was cursed by the priests of Eleusis. You do not enforce secrecy at that level about a theatrical performance. You enforce it when what you are protecting is a pharmacological formula embedded in a ritual system whose effects administered without proper context and preparation could be dangerous or could be dismissed as mere intoxication, destroying the tradition's capacity to do what it actually did for 3,000 initiates per year. What they were protecting for 9 centuries was a recipe. And Demeter, the grain goddess at the center of the mysteries, the deity who taught humanity to sow and harvest, had as her primary sacred substance the grain that grew the fungus that made the drink. She was not worshipped in spite of the ergot. She was worshipped through it. All right, let's go. Number 7, San Pedro. In the high desert of coastal Peru, 400 kilometers north of Lima, a site called Chavín de Huántar rises from a narrow valley between 2 spurs of the Andes. Its stone architecture is massive, intricate, and old. Older than the Parthenon, older than Rome, older than most of what the Western tradition considers classical. The earliest construction phases, dated by radiocarbon analysis to between 1200 and 900 BCE, produced a complex of inner galleries, sunken plazas, and platform mounds, whose full extent continued to emerge through excavation well into the 2000s. Julio César Tello, the Peruvian archaeologist who first documented Chavín systematically in 1919, recognized immediately that this was not a residential site. The architecture was ceremonial. The iconography, a terrifying fanged deity combining features of jaguar, serpent, caiman, and human, now known as the Chavín staff god, dominated the carved stone throughout the site and radiated outward through trade networks into ceramic, textile, and goldwork traditions across the Andean world for more than 500 years. The primary active compound at the center of that iconographic dominance was identified chemically in 2019. A study published in Antiquity by archaeologists John Rick and Miriam Kohler reported on residue analysis conducted on drug preparation paraphernalia, snuffing tubes, bone spatulas, shell containers, recovered from restricted interior galleries at Chavín. The residues identified vilca, the psychoactive compound from anodin and theraceeds, and botanical remains consistent with Echinopsis pachanoi, the San Pedro cactus, which contains the phenethylamine alkaloid mescaline. The cactus was not new to Peruvian archaeology. A ceramic vessel produced by the Chavín culture itself, now in the Rafael Larco Herrera Museum in Lima, depicts a stylized San Pedro with its characteristic 4-ribbed cross-section emerging directly from the head of the Chavín staff god. Not held by the deity, not placed at the deity's feet, growing from the deity's skull. The plant is where the god's thoughts originate. At full ceremonial dose, mescaline produces complex visual phenomena, geometric reorganization of perception, dissolution of the boundary between observer and environment. What clinical researchers at multiple institutions have documented as a reliable shift in the self versus world processing of the nervous system. The dose required from fresh San Pedro flesh is substantial, approximately 20 to 30 grams of dry material, corresponding to several kilograms of fresh cactus. The preparation process takes hours. The Shivan priests were not casually dosing initiates. They were operating a precision pharmacological instrument inside an architectural context, explicitly designed to amplify and direct its effects. Miriam Kollar's acoustic study of Shivan's galleries, published in 2012 following multi-year sound measurements, found that the interior stone corridors produce specific resonance effects. Standing waves in the frequency range known to alter auditory perception, channeled through architectural sightlines that deliberately disorient spatial orientation. The galleries are dark. The acoustics are engineered. The mescaline is already active. The experience reported across Andean traditions of San Pedro use a becoming jaguar, a merger with the fanged deity, a dissolution of the ordinary human boundary and its replacement with something larger, is not a metaphor for what happens in those galleries. It is a description of what happens in those galleries, in that darkness, with that chemistry and that sound. Over 500 years of Shivan cultural dominance in the Andes, the San Pedro cactus was not incidental to the religion. The religion was built around what the cactus made possible. The deity in the stone and the deity in the chemistry were the same deity. 32 centuries ago. The cactus still grows in Peru. The fanged god still wears its cross-section on his skull in stone in Lima behind museum glass. All right, let's go. Number 6, ayahuasca. There is a pharmacological combination in the upper Amazon basin that should not exist. Not because the chemistry is impossible, but because the precision required to discover it through trial and error in a rainforest containing tens of thousands of plant species approaches a probability that no reasonable model accounts for with the word accident. Banistriopsis caapi is a large woody vine that grows through the Amazonian understory. Its bark and vine body contain beta-carboline alkaloids, harmine, harmaline, and tetrahydroharmine, that function as monoamine oxidase inhibitors. MAO compounds that block a class of gut enzymes that normally deactivate certain tryptamine molecules before they reach the bloodstream. Psychotria viridis is a small leafy shrub common across the same Amazonian region whose leaves contain N-dimethyltryptamine. DMT, the compound with the highest documented affinity for the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor, producing the most complete and complex visionary experiences in either clinical or ethnographic record. DMT consumed orally without enzyme inhibition produces nothing. The monoamine oxidase in the gut destroys it within minutes. The molecule is inert as an oral psychedelic without the inhibitor. When the vine and the leaf are combined and prepared as a decoction, the vine's MAOI activity allows the DMT to survive digestion intact, reach the bloodstream, cross the blood-brain barrier, and produce for 4 to 8 hours an experience that every tradition that has used it and every clinical protocol that has studied it consistently describes as the most significant event in the participant's life. The probability calculation for arriving at this specific two-plant combination by random experimentation among 80,000 plant species is not small. It approaches 0. The two active plants produce no dramatic external signal when combined. You would not notice their interaction by observation. You would need to prepare the right decoction in the right proportions, correctly attribute the effects to the combination rather than to one plant, and document the finding well enough to transmit it. In every Amazonian tradition that uses ayahuasca, the account of discovery is the same. The plants communicated the combination, not metaphorically, directly. A shaman in a state of plant communication received the instruction from the vine itself. The earliest physical evidence of ayahuasca preparation dates to approximately 1000 CE. A kit of preparation materials recovered from a rock shelter in the Lipez region of Bolivia by Melanie Miller and colleagues, published in PNAS in 2019, containing residues of DMT, bufotenine, and cocaine. The multi-compound pharmacological tradition documented here is at least 1,000 years old. The practice it reflects is almost certainly older. In Shipibo-Conibo tradition, the entity encountered through ayahuasca is not a hallucination produced by the drink. It is the madre, feminine, serpentine, specifically the vine. She is addressed with the protocols appropriate to a relationship: approach, gratitude, reciprocity, respect for conditions. She withdraws when those conditions are violated. She teaches when they are honored. A 2021 study published in Scientific Reports documented measurable alterations in default mode, network connectivity persisting between sessions in experienced ayahuasca practitioners compared to controls. The network that generates the narrative self, the ongoing story each person maintains about who they are, is measurably altered in its connectivity by repeated ayahuasca ceremony. This is not what most pharmacological compounds do. This is what sustained relationships do. The Shipibo did not discover a compound that alters neural connectivity. They developed a relationship with a being that insists on being approached correctly, and the result of approaching it correctly over time is that you become someone different. The vine as teacher. The vine as deity. The biochemistry and the theology arrive at the same place from opposite directions, and neither one fully explains what the other is looking at. All right, let's go. Number 5, Amanita muscaria, the most recognizable mushroom in human iconography. Red cap, white spots, prominent stem. Appears in the rock paintings of Tassili Najar in the Algerian Sahara. Estimated to date between 7,000 and 9,000 BCE. It appears in medieval European manuscript illumination. In Shinto Japan. In the visual vocabulary of Northern European folklore, Mesoamerican codices, and today on packaging from breakfast cereals to video game power-ups. The visual template for mushroom across the global iconographic vocabulary is Amanita muscaria. Not because it is the most common mushroom. It is not. Because it is the one that matters. In 1968, mycologist R. Gordon Wasson published Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality, proposing that Amanita muscaria was the Vedic Soma, the supreme plant deity of the Rig Veda. I will address the Soma question when we reach the top of this list. What is not in serious dispute is the Siberian connection that formed the core of Wasson's evidence. Ethnographic records from the 18th and 19th centuries document Amanita muscaria in ceremonial contexts among the Koryak, Chukchi, Tungus, Yukagir, and Kamchadale, peoples of Siberia. The naturalist Georg Wilhelm Steller, accompanying Vitus Bering's 1741 expedition to Kamchatka, recorded the use directly. The ethnographer Waldemar Jokelson documented it with systematic detail between 1900 and 1902, including a specific practice that entered German zoological literature before it entered Western pharmacology. Ceremonial participants who could not afford the mushroom could drink the urine of those who had consumed it. Ibotenic acid and muscimol, the primary active compounds in Amanita muscaria, are excreted through the kidneys in active form. Jockelson did not record this as rumor. He confirmed the pharmacological logic is correct. The chemistry of Amanita muscaria is not psilocybin chemistry. It is not serotonergic. The active compounds act primarily on GABA-A and glutamate NMDA receptors. The resulting experience is described consistently across traditions and clinical observations as fundamentally different from classic psychedelics. Simultaneous stimulation and sedation, dramatic alterations in perceived size of self and environment, intense color vivification, and what users describe as encounters with small beings. The little people in Koryak terminology who communicate in ceremony. The mushroom spirits were not considered metaphors for the compound's effect. They were genuine, non-human intelligences encountered through the mushroom's mediation. The mushroom was the door. What came through the door was something else. The Norse berserker question has never been definitively resolved. Saga literature describes warriors entering battle in states of extraordinary physical performance, pain suppression, and fearlessness attributed in the text to a wrath invoked through specific pre-battle ritual. The botanist Samuel Udman proposed Amanita muscaria as the pharmacological substrate in 1784. No direct physical evidence from Norse archaeological contexts has confirmed this. But Musumol's documented effects, stimulation and suppression occurring simultaneously, dramatic disconnection from normal physical sensation, match the berserker phenomenology more precisely than any other candidate compound proposed in the intervening 240 years. In Siberian tradition, Amanita muscaria is not the highest god. It is the negotiator, the entity that permits communication between the human world and the spirit world, which are otherwise inaccessible to each other. The shaman's relationship is primarily with what the mushroom introduces. The mushroom is the diplomat. This framing the psychoactive plant as intermediary rather than deity appears across multiple traditions in this list and reflects a conceptual distinction more sophisticated than the term primitive religion can accommodate. The mushroom opens something. What was on the other side is what the traditions built themselves around. All right, let's go. Number 4, Iboga. In the equatorial rainforest of Gabon, Cameroon, and the Republic of Congo, a small understory shrub bears pale flowers and berries the size of olives. Tabernanthe iboga. The root bark produces ibogaine, a complex indole alkaloid that acts simultaneously on opioid receptors, kappa opioid receptors, serotonin transporters, NMDA glutamate receptors, and sigma-1 receptors. No other known psychoactive compound has this receptor profile. No other psychoactive experience has the ibogaine profile. At full ceremonial dose, calibrated by the Nganga against the initiate's body and preparation history, typically involving between 200 and 800 grams of fresh root bark, ibogaine produces an experience lasting between 15 and 24 hours. Continuous, without the rhythmic arc of most psychedelic compounds. Ibogaine arrives, occupies, and does not leave until it finishes. What happens in those hours is consistent across traditions and clinical settings to a degree that is pharmacologically remarkable. Initiates report a visual life review beginning in childhood. Their own existence played back to them in detailed third-person visions they cannot control and cannot interrupt. The review does not present what the initiate's narrative self would prefer to remember. It presents what happened. The Bwaiti religion of the Fang people of Gabon centers on iboga not as a plant used in ceremony. Iboga is the ceremony. The initiation is called Bweti itself. the central event without which no Fong adult has full standing in the community. The dose administered is not symbolic. It is set at the full visionary threshold deliberately because partial experience of iboga is, in Bwiti theology, failed experience. The Nganga's calibration work is specifically aimed at ensuring every initiate makes contact. The fine cosmological account of iboga's origin describes it as the discovery of the first humans, the mechanism by which the primordial human beings learned what existed beyond death and returned to teach it to those who remained living. The plant is the proof. The initiation is the curriculum. Howard Lotsof discovered ibogane's anti-addiction properties in 1962 by accident, consuming it recreationally as a heroin addict in New York. He emerged 36 hours later with his withdrawal symptoms resolved and his craving absent in a way no prior cessation attempt had produced. He spent the next 30 years attempting to have ibogaine developed as an addiction treatment. The FDA granted it orphan drug status for opioid dependency in 1993. It remains Schedule I in the United States. The 2023 Stanford study, published in Nature Medicine, enrolled 30 U.S. Special Operations veterans with treatment-resistant PTSD and traumatic brain injury. A single ibogaine session with magnesium supplementation to manage cardiac risk produced clinically significant reductions in PTSD symptom severity in more than 80% of participants at the 1-month follow-up. The sample is preliminary. The effect size is not preliminary. It is the largest documented effect size for any treatment of combat PTSD in the published clinical literature. The Bwiti Nganga would not be surprised. They have been achieving this outcome for several hundred years at minimum. The Fang word for iboga translates roughly as the teacher. Not the god, the teacher. In Bwiti theology, the plant does not demand devotion. It demands attention. 15 to 24 hours of it, without pause. It teaches what it wants to teach, not what you came in hoping to learn. The distinction between a god and a teacher is one that the Bwiti drew deliberately. What you bring home from the Bwiti initiation is not belief. It is information. All right, let's go. Number 3, the Blue Lotus. In the collection of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, among the 5,398 objects recovered by Howard Carter from the burial chamber of Tutankhamun between 1922 and 1932, there is a golden chalice fashioned in the exact form of Nymphia caerulea, the Egyptian blue lotus. It was recovered directly beside the boy pharaoh's mummified body. It was designed to hold a drink. The choice of form was not decorative. Nymphia caerulea is not a lotus in botanical terms. It is a water lily, a perennial aquatic plant with powder blue petals, floating at the surface of the Nile, opening at dawn and closing at dusk. This daily cycle made it, in Egyptian theological logic, a botanical reenactment of creation itself. Atum, the self-created god, emerged from the primordial waters on the first morning of existence. The blue lotus emerged from the Nile every morning. The flower was not a symbol of Adam's act. It was Atum's act, repeated daily in miniature, available to any priest standing at the river's edge. This iconographic identification appears in Egyptian art with a consistency that suggests not convention but insistence. At Amarna, the short-lived capital of the pharaoh Akhenaten, wall reliefs depict members of the royal family inhaling directly from blue lotus blossoms in scenes that are not allegorical. People in the images are putting flowers to their faces and breathing in. The images record a practice. The pharmacology of Nymphia caerulea remained unstudied until 1978, when analysis of the flower's chemistry identified apomorphine and nuciferin as primary active compounds. Apomorphine is a non-selective dopamine agonist, used in Parkinson's disease management at higher doses and as an emetic in veterinary medicine. At lotus flower concentrations, the effect in humans is mild euphoria and a specific alteration in visual quality, heightened color saturation, a dreamlike perceptual softness, warmth without sedation. Nuciferine is a psychoactive alkaloid with mild opioid receptor interaction, producing relaxation and a reduction in anxiety without full sedation. Neither compound alone produces dramatic pharmacological effects. The Egyptian priests were not dosing on raw lotus flowers. Residue analysis from New Kingdom, period ceramic amphorae, conducted by researchers at the University of Turin and published in 2010, identified consistent evidence of fermented grape combined with plant additive residues across multiple vessels from the same assemblage. Among those residues, blue lotus, also mandrake, which contains scopolamine and atropine at concentrations sufficient to produce, at low doses, sedation, mild delirium, and heightened suggestibility. Apomorphine combined with alcohol produces significantly enhanced dopaminergic effect through simultaneous action on reward pathway in GABA systems. Add low-dose anticholinergic compounds from mandrake to that matrix, and you have a compound psychoactive formulation calibrated across 3 distinct pharmacological pathways simultaneously. This was not an accidental blending of available botanicals. This was engineering, practiced across 3,000 years of a civilization that had the administrative continuity and the priestly transmission structure to refine it across centuries. The lotus opened at dawn. The priests were waiting. The chalice in Tutankhamun's tomb was not buried with a pharaoh as a symbol of religious belief. It was buried with him as equipment. Whatever state the blue lotus delivered was considered necessary for the passage ahead. Death was the final opening. The lotus was the practice run. All right, let's go. Number 2, peyote. In 2005, researchers at the University of Texas radiocarbon dated a collection of peyote buttons recovered from the Shumla Caves in the Pecos River Canyon of southwest Texas. The specimens dated to between 3,780 and 3,660 BCE. Not a contaminant. Not a misidentification. Peyote, preserved in a cave, 5,700 years old. Lophofera williamsii barely rises above the soil surface in the Chihuahuan Desert of northern Mexico and southern Texas. No spines, no dramatic form. A small gray-green disc pressed against the ground, producing a pale rose flower in the wet season. You could cross a field of it without recognizing it as remarkable. Inside the disc, at approximately 0.4% of dry weight, is mescaline, a phenethylamine alkaloid that acts on 5-HT2A serotonin receptors and produces complex visual, auditory, and somatic experiences at doses between 200 and 400 milligrams. Natural peyote contains more than 50 other alkaloids alongside mescaline, including pelletine, anhelonidine, and hordenine. Compounds that appear to account for the qualitative differences practitioners consistently report between natural peyote ceremony and synthetic mescaline alone. Among the Huichol of the Sierra Madre Occidental in Jalisco, whose peyote tradition is the oldest continuously documented in the Americas, the cactus is not a medicine and not an entheogen in the way those terms are used in Western pharmacological literature. Peyote is a divine being with a name. Mescalito. In Huichol, Hikuri. Mescalito is explicitly described as a trickster. unpredictable, sometimes generous, sometimes withholding, capable of communicating specific information to specific people under specific conditions, and remaining entirely silent under others. Relationship with Mescalito requires years of sustained engagement. It is earned, not purchased. The annual Huichol Peyote pilgrimage, the Hikuri Naixa, has been documented in continuous practice from Karl Lumholtz's 1898 reports through the present day. The pilgrimage travels from the high mountains of Jalisco eastward across the Sierra to Wirikuta, the high desert in San Luis Potosí, where peyote grows in its traditional territory. In its traditional form, the journey covers approximately 900 kilometers, completed on foot, over weeks, 900 kilometers, for a cactus. Barbara Meyerhoff, the UCLA anthropologist whose 1974 ethnography, Peyote Hunt, remains the foundational text on Huichol peyote tradition, documented not only the ceremonial structure of the pilgrimage, but something more methodologically uncomfortable. During fieldwork conducted with the Mara Acame Ramon Medina Silva, she experienced in ceremony what she described in her published work as direct specific communication from an entity associated with the cactus. She documented this not as a belief system she had come to understand, but as an event she had participated in. The distinction is hers, and she held it deliberately. Clinical trials using mescaline at Johns Hopkins and NYU between 2010 and 2023 have documented what researchers call the entity encounter phenomenon in a measurable proportion of high-dose participants, the experience of meeting a conscious presence, often described by participants as the most real experience of their lives. Whether this is the same entity the Huichol describe is a question clinical protocol cannot answer. The phenomenology is the same. Peyote has been a Schedule I controlled substance in the United States since 1970, with an exemption for enrolled members of the Native American Church since a 1994 congressional amendment. The exemption covers the ceremony. It does not cover the 5,700-year-old fact that the relationship between this cactus and the humans who seek it has outlasted every legal and colonial system that has attempted to suppress it. The cactus is still in the Chihuahuan Desert. The pilgrims are still walking. Mescalito is still there when they arrive. All right, let's go. Number 1, Soma. In the collection of the Rig Veda, the oldest surviving sacred text in the Indo-European literary tradition, composed in archaic Sanskrit somewhere between 1500 and 1200 BCE, based on an oral tradition that extends centuries earlier, there are 1,028 hymns. Of those, 120 are addressed to a single figure, not to Indra, king of the gods, not to Agni, the fire deity whose role in Vedic ritual is foundational, to a figure described across those 120 hymns as simultaneously a plant, a liquid, a drink, a god, a cosmic intelligence, and the substance underlying all reality. Soma. No other sacred text in any religious tradition devotes a comparable proportion of its content to a single plant substance and addresses it directly as a divine being. The Quran mentions wine. The Bible mentions incense. The Rig Veda built 120 hymns about something you press through wool and drink. The hymns describe Soma's preparation in specific detail. The stalks are pounded on stones. The pulp is pressed through a wool filter. The resulting juice is mixed with milk and water and consumed in ritual by priests and, in the hymns themselves, by the gods. The hymns address Soma as a living being. O Soma, flow for Indra. Soma, you have made us immortal. Soma is the king, the first among the gods. Hymn 9.113 asks Soma directly to transport the worshippers to the abode of the gods after death. The text assumes that Soma works. that consuming it produces something so far outside normal human consciousness that the boundary between human and divine becomes, temporarily, permeable. The priests were not writing poetry about an agricultural product. They were writing theology about an experience they had actually had, produced by a substance they had actually consumed, in a ritual system refined over generations of priest-to-priest transmission. And then, at some point in the first millennium BCE, the botanical identity of soma was lost. The evidence is in the text itself. The late Vedic literature begins to show substitutions. Plants called somalata, which produce no documented psychoactive effect, used in soma rites because the original source was no longer available or no longer identifiable. Ritual descriptions begin to show gaps in preparation knowledge that earlier texts assume without explaining. By the time the Upanishadic period begins, around 800 BCE, soma has shifted in theological function. From an experiential encounter with divinity to a metaphysical principle, something that exists in the cosmos rather than something you press through wool. The ceremony continued. The substance was gone. 150 years of academic argument over soma's botanical identity have produced 5 serious candidates. R. Gordon Wasson's 1968 proposal of Amanita muscaria generated the most sustained debate. The Rigvedic descriptions support it in some passages and contradicted in others. The pressed liquid strained through wool does not obviously correspond to mushroom preparation, and some hymns imply a plant found near rivers rather than in forest understory. David Flattery and Martin Schwartz, in their 1989 study Hauma and Harmaline, published by the University of California Press, advanced Peganum harmala, Syrian rue, as the most pharmacologically coherent candidate, identifying 34 distinct textual characteristics of soma in the Sanskrit, of which Syrian rue satisfies 30. The plant's MAOI chemistry would potentiate other compounds in the ritual mixture, and its geographic distribution matches the Vedic homeland more precisely than Amanita. Ephedra sinica has been proposed for its stimulant alkaloids and documented use in related Central Asian traditions. Cannabis has been proposed. None has achieved consensus. No consensus exists. This means something specific. The most elaborately developed divine relationship in the oldest sacred text in continuous use. A relationship detailed across 120 hymns, built into the ritual architecture of a tradition that has survived unbroken from 1500 BCE to the present, has a botanical identity that 3,000 years of scholarship cannot definitively establish. Every other Vedic deity corresponds to something identifiable in the physical world: the sky, the fire, the storm, the sun. Soma alone remains unresolved because the knowledge was broken. The transmission was severed. The priests who maintained the soma rites after the original compound was gone were not frauds. They did what religious institutions do when the specific, actual experience at the core of a tradition becomes inaccessible. They maintained the form. They preserved the hymns, the timing, the ritual vessels, the priest protocols. They held the shape of the relationship. They had just lost the other party. What those hymns were describing, the thing that made priests willing to build the most elaborate religious poetry in the ancient world around a single pressed beverage, we cannot be fully certain of. We know it worked. We know it worked so completely, so reliably, so undeniably, that when it was gone, the hymns to it continued for 3,000 years anyway. A god you could drink, whose taste 120 hymns tried to describe, whose botanical body was then lost so completely that the priests kept talking to the absence. Consider the pattern this closes out. 10 plants, 10 traditions. Every one of them arriving independently at the same conclusion, that inside a specific root, a specific mushroom, a specific vine, a specific seed, there is something present, something that responds, something that communicates under conditions. And when that something was available, when the vine could be prepared, when the cactus could be harvested, when the mushroom came up in the right season, the encounter it produced was considered the most significant experience a human being could have. Soma is the one tradition on this list that lost access to the source and kept the framework anyway. The prayers outlasted the compound. The relationship continued after one party left. What stops you reading that is not the pharmacology. It is the fidelity. 3,000 years of addressing the empty press stone as though something were still listening. Maybe it was. The question the Rig Veda leaves open is the same question all 10 traditions leave open. What was actually on the other side of that permeable boundary? Not the mechanism. The mechanism is well characterized, not the neuroscience. The neuroscience is increasingly detailed. What was there when the boundary opened? The oldest religious puzzle in the world still running. 10 traditions. 10 plant bodies. One question. The pattern across every item in this list points towards something the standard history of religion is not built to accommodate. That the most significant religious experiences in the ancient world were not belief. They were events. Repeatable, pharmacologically induced, cross-culturally consistent events. Events that 10 independent civilizations, separated by oceans and centuries and every conceivable difference of language and cosmology, described in structurally identical terms. The 20th century's project was to separate the pharmacological mechanism from the theological interpretation, to say that the compound explains the experience and that the experience was misunderstood as a divine encounter. The 21st century's clinical data is making this separation progressively harder to maintain. Not because the pharmacology is wrong, because the consistent phenomenological signature across clinical settings, the entity encounter, the noetic quality, the persistent and unanimous sense of having contacted something external rather than generated something internal, appears reliably across controlled protocols in secular university medical centers. What the plant god traditions were responding to, we cannot settle from outside the experience. What we can establish is that they were responding to something consistent, something repeatable, something 10 independent traditions across 6,000 years of use found significant enough to build entire civilizations of meaning around. The questions it leaves open are not pharmacological. The pharmacology is well characterized. The questions are about what the pharmacology reveals. What precisely a human nervous system contacts when the boundary between ordinary consciousness and whatever lies beyond it becomes temporarily permeable. The traditions had answers. The research has not yet caught up to the questions. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.